My name is Nicola Wright from LibertyWorks, and I'd like to thank you all for coming along tonight. LibertyWorks is an activist organisation that advocates for drastic reduction in government control over people's economic and personal lives. We celebrate liberty where it exists and fight the erosion of liberty when it's under threat. We do this because liberty is the essential element in human progress. Please look us up at libertyworks.org.au, where you can join as a member, or contact us if you would like to get involved. This event is also supported by Liberty WA, the Mancal Economic Education Foundation and the Australian Libertarian Society, organisations all dedicated to the promotion of personal and economic liberty in Australia. We were very excited to hear that Aaron Stonehouse, a Liberal Democrats candidate, was elected to the upper house at the recent WA state election. Aaron is WA's first Libertarian Member of Parliament and also its youngest at age 26, looking to put the heavy metal into WA politics. I think I speak for everyone in the Liberty community when I say that we will support Aaron in any way we can. Tonight's topic is the ever-increasing nanny state. There is hardly a day that goes by when we're not confronted with a rule or regulation that hinders our choices and does nothing to promote liberty and prosperity or to protect our freedoms. At LibertyWorks, we seek to combat the encroachment of nanny state policies where possible, and with that aim in mind, we look forward to hearing Aaron's thoughts. Please join me in welcoming Aaron Stonehouse.
Hey, it's this is an enormous group. It's almost like an amazing accomplishment to get so many liberty-minded people together in one place. Definitely the biggest group I've spoken to. It's a good thing I'm not some amateur who was accidentally elected, or I might be nervous. But the alcohol will certainly help with that. So I'm the Liberal Democrats member for the upper house of the West Australian Parliament. My region is the South Metro region, and I'll be talking a little bit about the nanny state. The nanny state is far from a new concept. Indeed, it's considerably older than I am. The British Conservative MP Ian MacLeod is believed to have coined the phrase in an article in The Spectator in 1965, condemning the imposition of a 70-mile-per-hour speed limit on British motorways. You might be forgiven for thinking that the nanny state has been impeding our freedom, our forward progress, mile by sluggish mile, ever since. But let us be clear from the outset. Some laws are simply... I don't think there is a volume setting on this. Hey, here we go. That's better. That's how microphones work. So some laws are simply common sense necessities, and unless you're a Marxist revolutionary, theft is wrong and should be punished. Assault, deprivation of liberty, or deliberate acts which place others at risk, likewise. Ian MacLeod knew that. He was originally a lawyer for trade, after all. But what MacLeod objected to, what he derided when he coined the term nanny state, were the growing body of laws which serve to hamper individual liberty and to wrap individuals in the legislative equivalent of cotton wool, almost to the point of suffocation. Laws which treat us as though we're children, incapable of making reasoned decisions of our own. It's a distinction which is well made, and one with which I agree. Laws that impose a certain level of safety that a reasonable person would otherwise not be able to assess are not nanny state laws. I may not agree with them, but there is a clear distinction in my mind. However, cotton wool laws have multiplied exponentially since the nanny state was first recognised as such, the point at which we are now awash with them. It is time we recognise the government's role is to create and maintain a framework within which we can live our lives as we choose, that our default setting should be the legality of an action rather than the illegality, that risk to self is not the same as harm to others, and that such risk should be managed through individual choice. In other words, it's time we re-embraced the harm principle. The harm principle is another phrase that was common in the 60s, but in this case it had its roots 100 years prior, in the writing of John Stuart Mill. Writing in 1859, Mill maintained that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. And Mill goes on to note that one should not be compelled to do or forbear from doing things because, in the opinion of others, it would make him happier or healthier because others believed it to be wise or even right. The only part of the conduct of anyone for which he is amenable to society, writes Mill, is that which concerns others, and the part which merely concerns himself, his independence is, of right, absolute. Once over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign. I'm sure that at a meeting convened under the auspices of LibertyWorks, I'm preaching to the converted when I hark back to these founding principles of libertarianism. But they're worth repeating. Our individual independence is, of right, absolute, and sovereignty resides within each one of us. Those are obvious philosophical starting points for you and I, so why would anyone feel differently? Why do people tolerate a nanny state which spends so much of its time and so much of our own money telling us what we can and can't do? I suspect there are two overriding reasons. The first has been called the status quo bias, the willingness to go with the flow. For example, everyone else seems to think plain packaging is a good idea for the tobacco industry, so who am I to rock the boat? The second might be termed the rule of direct impact. Unless a law impacts directly upon us, we're less likely to be motivated to oppose it. I'm not a smoker, so why would I care if there's plain packaging? Add to this model of passive consumerism a gaggle of public health advocates and lobbyists who are motivated by a steady stream of public research grants and government appointments, and generations of government talking down to the average man in the street, and you have a perfect breeding ground for apathy and disconnect, a vacuum into which government cannot help but insert itself. As Western Australians, we like to think of ourselves as a little more rugged, a little more independent than our eastern neighbours, don't we? Our pints of beer are certainly better than their schooners, and our wide open horizons ingrain a respect for individuality and the pioneer spirit. I wish that was still the case, but in fact the example here in Western Australia, particularly on the back of Labor's recent landslide victory, is far from reassuring. Western Australia is bound hand and foot by red tape. Take our mining industry, for example. Many of you will have heard of the Yeelary mine near Wiluna, which had its environmental approval knocked back by the state watchdog last year because of the effect it could, mark you, not would, could have on blind, microscopic desert prawns that are less than a millimetre in length. Or Anglo Gold at Ashanti, who were forced to seek 66 different approvals before their Tropicana gold project could go ahead in Kalgoorlie. That fades into near sanity when set beside the staggering 4,147 licenses, permits and approvals from a combination of federal, state and local government bodies required before the Roy Hill iron ore project and the Pilbara could break ground. We objected to a mining tax under the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd government, but a combination of complacency and apathy allow us to smother our state's single largest wealth producing industry and stupefying rules and regulations designed to make it less and less profitable for companies to mine and sell our state's resources. Nanny will tell us when we can play with our toys and when we have to put them away. As a state, we seem to have an almost pathological addiction to central planning. If the soon-to-be defunct Potato Marketing Corporation of WA isn't example enough, just look at the manner in which politicians from both major parties backed away from ending Western Power's state-backed monopoly over our electricity prices. And the negative impact that is having now on each and every one of us as we receive our first increased power bills for the new financial year. Or consider our retail hours and their associated regulations, which meant that Bunnings could open on a Sunday, but its neighbouring Masters couldn't if they wanted to sell white goods. The outcome, Masters closed. Consumer choice was sacrificed. Central planning didn't work in Soviet Russia, and it's been shown not to work in capitalist economies across the globe. But of course, here in WA, Nanny knows best. While potato pricing may not be the obvious concern for libertarians, I'm sure we're on much more familiar ground when I raise the question of vaping or e-cigarettes. And what may well be understood as the understatement of the year, quit.org.au, a bastion of the Nanny State masquerading as a perfectly innocuous health organisation, concludes on its website that, and I quote, "The regulation of electronic cigarettes in Australia is complex." No shit. In fact, while regulations vary in detail and effect from one state to another, the situation here in Western Australia is the strictest set of laws to be found on this subject anywhere in the Commonwealth. In a nutshell, while it's still legal to use e-cigarettes with or without nicotine, the state government has done almost everything within its power to make their purchase impossible. E-cigarettes, according to Nanny, are a product which mimics smoking. Like you, I didn't know that simply mimicking something was illegal. Just the other week, Malcolm Turnbull was mimicking Donald Trump in public. No one thought he was the President of the United States, just a pretty average stand-up comic in a nice tux to boot. But no, in this case, to mimic is the sin, and all manner of vaping and e-cigarette products have been deemed illegal simply because they allow someone to look as if they're smoking. At first, that rule was only applied to devices that actually resembled cigarettes. But more recently, the courts have decided that it's the way in which a device is used rather than its shape or size which creates the mimicry. As a result, it's been made an offence to sell or supply any such device in Western Australia. Oddly though, you can still import them perfectly legally and entirely above the board from any one of a small number of our neighbouring states and territories which allow their legal sale. Those, of course, are Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia. It's basically every state and territory in the Commonwealth. WA stands alone, splendid and ridiculously isolated in its regulation of vaping and e-cigs. Ironically, leading tobacco companies like Philip Morris are on record as wishing to transition their own business models to provide for a smoke-free future. One in which they would replace harmful nicotine-laced products with non-nicotine alternatives such as vapor. Health professionals are similarly on the record as acknowledging that the single best means of helping someone quit smoking is to provide that person with a less harmful alternative. But it is government and legislators who benefit both directly and indirectly from the revenue raised through tobacco taxes who continually stand in the way of progress. Meanwhile, for all the legislation and all the red tape we've produced in recent years, the actual use of e-cigs and vaping devices remains legal in WA. You just have to be willing to break the law to obtain them in the first place. Like me, you've doubtless seen many people using them out in the streets and in daily life, harming no one but themselves, thumbing their nose at Nanny, who maintains that there can be no smoke without fire. The Nanny State doesn't just tell us what we can and can't smoke. It is just as committed to telling us what we can and can't drink. In the first week of the new Parliament, a chorus of public health do-gooders got together in Perth to launch a new report titled Alcohol, Anytime, Any Place, Anywhere, addressing the public availability of alcohol in Australia. The report was published by the Foundation of Alcohol Research and Education, the Institute of Alcohol Studies, and the Alcohol Youth Action Coalition. You can probably tell by their names how all these groups feel about alcohol. Even the name of their report tells you a lot about their view of the world. They obviously intended for it to sound ominous, but to libertarians like us, we don't see a problem with alcohol being available anytime, any place, or anywhere. If someone wants to enjoy a glass of wine after dropping off their kids at school, or enjoy a beer after a long day at work, who are we to object? I reject the idea that alcohol is something that needs to be locked up behind bulletproof glass and only available during a full moon. Nothing, to my mind, typifies the logic of the Nanny State more than the Labor Party's promise to ban alcohol advertising in Western Australia. This policy basically says that alcohol has the potential to deliver a bad outcome, and upon looking at alcohol, individuals may spontaneously decide to drink vast amounts of alcohol, and that the government must limit the availability and accessibility of alcohol to protect people from themselves. What the advocates of this policy fail to recognise is that it doesn't matter whether or not alcohol is advertised prominently. People don't get drunk by looking simply at an image or a video. Many Australians have a well-stocked liquor cabinet in their homes, and yet, when they come home from work, they don't feel the need to suddenly empty the cabinet and drink themselves into a stupor. They don't do that because they have jobs to go to in the morning, because they have commitments to their family and their community. In other words, it's their social bonds of kinship and their fellow man and community that prevent them from acting out, not any artificial constraint imposed by government. That's why any government measure that's designed to encourage good behaviour by way of limiting the availability or accessibility of alcohol is doomed to failure. In fact, the more the government encourages young people not to drink, the more likely they are to drink in a reckless manner. If you want any validation of that theory, go to Europe, and you'll see many people drinking alcohol everywhere. Young men and women carry around bottles with no need to hide their shameful activity in brown paper bags. There's no such thing as a lockout, and you can buy alcohol wherever you please. And what's the consequence? Central European countries like the Czech Republic have one of the lowest rates of alcohol-related violence in the Western world. If you think buying a drink is hard in Western Australia, try selling one. Western Australia is one of the hardest places to open a small bar in Australia. To get a liquor licence for a small bar in this state, you need to create an ad in the West Australian, conduct a letter drop for 200 metres around your business, and allow 28 days for your neighbours to respond. Then you must serve notices on all hospitals, schools, police stations, childcare centres and aged care facilities and churches in your area, after which you're required to lodge copies of your house management policy, code of conduct and management plan with the regulator. And then there are the councils to deal with, of course. In total, there are about 62 different types of liquor licences and 24 different types of liquor permits for licensees to acquire if they wish to sell alcohol. It is literally enough to drive you to drink. Then there's of course the taxation system. According to a 2016 report by the OECD, Australia has the third highest rate of taxation on alcohol amongst member countries. This explains why, when you go overseas, in spite of the import costs, you can often buy Australian alcohol cheaper than if you bought it here in Australia. Taxes on alcohol aren't just high, but they're also confusing. Thanks to 2 different taxation systems and as many as 16 different tax rates, combined with a raft of potential concessions. Just one example, a case of a certain type of ginger beer is subject to $21.54 of excise tax, while the same sized case of a similar ginger beer is subject to only $8.70 of wine equalisation tax, because it, unlike its competitor, is classified as a fruit or vegetable wine. However, the more cheaply taxed version actually has twice the amount of alcohol by volume. If you think alcohol is a legislative minefield for consumers and producers, let me assure you that it's no easier for supermarkets. Aldi wants to sell its award-winning and very affordable liquor here in Western Australia, just as it does in the eastern states. But the regulator knocked back several of their applications in the past. Their reason being that the existing areas are already well catered to by other retailers, and another retailer would not be in the public interest. Let me just pause on that for a moment. This really activates my almonds. It's not the government's role to determine whether or not certain parts of the city are already well catered by certain types of retailers. If someone wants to open a hotel where there are already other hotels, they should have that right. Who knows, maybe they'll figure out a better way to do it. And they may even attract a new business. Maybe they won't and they'll fail. Regardless, it's the role of consumers to test and determine the value and necessity of consumer goods, not the government. But if, by some miracle, you manage to wade through all the aforementioned bureaucracy, your nightmare will continue as you trade. Bottle shops in non-metro areas of West Australia are not allowed to operate on Sundays unless they've applied for and have received an exemption from the regulator. Meanwhile, you can go into a hotel in the country on a Sunday and buy the exact same carton of beer that you're not allowed to buy at the bottle shop on the same day. But enough about alcohol. Whether you want to drink at a time and a place that suits you, or you want to smoke a cigarette in public, vape, or indulge in any other number of activities which will harm no one but yourself, a significant portion of the state of Western Australia's government service is out to stop you, trip you, or at the very least slow you down. But we should never forget that on top of all this state interference and regulation and do-goodism, we have a super nanny, our very own federal Mother Superior in Canberra, adding yet another stultifying layer of bureaucracy. Scott Morrison announced in the 2016 budget that annual increases of 12.5% to the tobacco excise would continue for 4 more years, making Australia's stance on smoking one of the toughest in the world. With the average price of a packet of cigarettes sitting at about $40, many public health do-gooders have hailed this outcome as an effective way to stop people from lighting up. But instead of quitting, many smokers have responded by buying cut-price cigarettes from what's known as the illicit tobacco trade, which distributes approximately 2.4 million kilograms of tobacco across Australia every year. Scott Morrison told us that he expects to raise $4.7 billion from smokers, but as the budget papers show, not a cent of that will be spent on anti-smoking activities. This makes you wonder, is the purpose of the tobacco tax to prevent people from smoking or simply to punish them? Since smoking is highly addictive, raising prices isn't necessarily going to force people to quit. But since smokers are more likely to be people on low incomes, many will look for more affordable ways to get their fix. This could mean buying cheap imitation cigarettes from illegal traders, where a pack of 20 cigarettes from China will cost as little as $10. These knockoffs often don't contain any labels, and the consumer has no way of knowing what chemicals or substances are in them. Small... Yo. Sorry about that, folks. Sadly, we could spend all night listing ludicrous laws and regulations that hamper and hinder us, both here in West Australia and across Australia as a whole. But we would also benefit from taking a moment to consider the global picture. Over the last 5 years, we've seen the wholly unpredicted rise of populism and the alt-right. We saw it a few weeks ago in the French flirtation with Marine Le Pen and her Front National. We saw it in its success in Britain during the highly contentious Brexit debate. And it was writ large for the whole world to see in the election of Donald Trump as President of the United States. Populism is, for lack of a better word, popular at the moment. But populism is also dangerous, and we as libertarians need to remember that. Populism is hinged on this premise that the good of the majority and that the will of the majority is sacrosanct. Populism and individualism may be fellow travellers for a time, but they can never be a true partnership. Small government Republicans in the US might well have cheered Trump in the lead up to the election, but when faced with the reality of his protectionism, legislative agenda, more and more of them are distancing themselves from their purported leader. In the UK, the populist UKIP, UK Independence Party, has seen its vote collapse to just 2%, months after it successfully forced the issue of EU membership to a vote. In that case, the single popular policy for which they stood had effectively been achieved, being adopted by the major parties. So the UKIP party withered almost overnight. And I think that may well prove to be the fate for many populist movements. They're not here to stay, and they're not going to be with us for the long haul, because they've not been built upon a solid set of core beliefs. But therein lies our difference, our distinction. As libertarians, we do have a set of core beliefs, and they are far more deeply seated than a simple desire to be left alone. Libertarians of the past had a concrete set of values combined with a missionary zeal that encouraged them to not just remain silent, but to export their philosophy to the world. Ayn Rand didn't write Atlas Shrugged just to make money to live comfortably. She wrote it to show the world that it does need prime movers and to warn everyone what would happen without them. Barry Goldwater didn't take over the Republican Party in the 70s simply to make sure the guns in his living room would be safe. He did it to transform the Republican Party from an elitist organisation into the breeding ground that would eventually elect Ronald Reagan. Margaret Thatcher didn't take over the Conservative Party in the 80s just to make the point that women can kick ass and take names. She took it over to destroy the post-war consensus that was dominated by the ideas of a welfare state, nationalised industry, and close regulation of the economy. Libertarianism isn't just about my freedom or my free enterprise. We don't want to just take over the world to be left alone. Our desire for less regulation and less coercion isn't born of some selfish desire. And we're not just a bunch of basement-dwelling, neck-bearded weirdos who shun social interaction. I hope I speak for most of us. We have a set of core values that are rooted in the teachings of the greatest thinkers of the Enlightenment. Values of tolerance, of free minds and of free markets, of accountable, transparent government, of moral autonomy and of civil society. We share these ideas because we genuinely believe that they will lead us to a more prosperous and harmonious society. When each person is free to live their own lives, to make their own choices, either for better or worse, they're able to experience a full human life. When we have freedom of choice over our own bodies and our own minds, we can construct our lives as we see fit. Free markets and the free exchange of ideas have led to innovation and technology that's lifted millions of people out of poverty. This was done not through social engineering or central planning, but through freedom, by autonomous individuals interacting voluntarily in pursuit of their own goals. It is in the spirit of the champions of our movement and the success story that is free market capitalism that I encourage you to reflect, as you come, I hope, as I have, to the realization that we cannot create the society we want by simply being passive. We have to become more active and to adopt an almost missionary zeal wherein we're not afraid to talk about our values, to explain what makes them better than the alternatives, and to promote a government modelled in their image. We need to develop a new, more active libertarian movement. It's these values that keep me motivated in Parliament. And it's why I declared a war, or perhaps a jihad, so to speak, on the Nanny State on the 24th of May. I implore those of you here this evening on this 4th of July to join me in sharing this libertarian message. We need to seize the moral high ground from the authoritarians and the statists, because we have the more ethical, consistent and compassionate message. And it's time we started to share it. Thank you. Now, if we've got some time, we can do a quick Q&A, maybe for like 10 minutes. Yeah. So if anyone wants to just put up their hand and then we can bring the microphone to you. Oh yeah, or come down actually, might be easier. Do you have a question, Ellie?
What are the top issues that you thought in terms of the Nanny State that you're intending to change?
Sorry, can you say that one more time?
What are the top issues of Nanny Statism that you identified that you wish to challenge?
You know, one of the ones that probably affects me the most is a lot of the smoking regulation. However, picking a top one is tough. I think overall, vaping is probably the most important one. That's the one where if we can get the nanny, the government out of the way, we can actually start to save people's lives. So I find that vaping is probably the most important. There's only so much that can be done at the state level with vaping until they reclassify the nicotine liquid for vaping devices at the federal level. You probably will have a hard time importing that stuff, but whatever we can do at the state level to make it easier for people to vape, the better. Millions of people have quit smoking in Europe and in the UK thanks to vaping, so that's definitely probably my top priority at the moment. Anyone else? Yeah.
Is there any policy? Damien Coletta, as this fine gentleman over there asked for. Is there any policy that you believe government should keep control of, i.e. healthcare or certain economic policies? Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not an anarchist, so I do believe there should be a small government. It's my view, sort of in the same view that John Locke had, that government should protect life, liberty and property. So there should be courts, there should be police, contracts should be enforced. However, I think just about everything else is done better in civil society. So a lot of the charitable organisations we have are done better by private individuals than done by government. One size doesn't fit all. So,
a sort of bloated welfare state and bloated healthcare system is very inefficient. A lot of people slip through the gaps. I'd rather see that stuff done at the ground level through civil society where possible. If government can help with some funds or some guidance, sure, but generally speaking, I think people in communities have a better idea of how to serve themselves and the members of their community than someone does in West Perth or in Canberra, for example.
G'day, Connor. What would a libertarian state government look like?
It'd be very, very small. I imagine, I'm thinking of Ron Swanson's idea of government where it's like one guy in a room with a button that lets him nuke any country, and that's it, that's the government. But for a state government, I imagine courts and police would be the most important thing. But a very small, very lean court system, a very small, very lean police service. Just about everything else can be done by private individuals. If we want the state government to fund things, then I'd much rather see it done through like a voucher system. So school vouchers, healthcare vouchers, things like that, where people can still get money for those essential services, but they have a choice of how they access those services. And so there's a little bit of competition in the market. So yeah, state government, probably about like a few dozen people administering where police and court resources go, and that'd probably be about it.
So you're basically a communist?
Yeah, I'm a horrible statist, yeah.
Eva Christensen, who do you think your main allies in the WA Parliament will be?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's not many people who agree with everything I have to say in the West Australian Parliament. The Liberal Party seems philosophically aligned, at least on paper, but when it comes to actions, they often fall short. Obviously they have to toe their party line. Steve Thomas, the Honourable Steve Thomas MLC, listening to him talk about economics, that guy really gets it. He knows a hell of a lot more than I do. And he's not afraid to sort of call out his colleagues, for their last 8 years of quite woeful financial management. But there's not really anyone who's a sort of classical liberal that I've found. There may be people who are rather libertarian when it comes to economic issues, but certainly not when it comes to social issues. I get along quite well with most of the people in the chamber, even the Greens. They're okay people. They have horrible ideas, but they're all right. And the crossbench, of course. So we've got the One Nation guys there, but Rick Mazza from the Shooters and Fishers Party, he seems to be a pretty consistent conservative. Probably a little more principled than some of the guys from the Liberal Party, or at least he can be a little more vocal about his values. But so far, I think it's going to come down to what the issue is. We've got a debate at the moment about euthanasia, and there's a possibility that something might be happening with euthanasia in the next couple of months. Of course, a lot of people from the Liberals are against that, but a lot of people on the left side of the chamber, the Greens and Labor, are for that. So I'll find natural allies there amongst the Greens and Labor on that issue. But when it comes to, say firearms or economic issues, I'll probably find allies on the other side. So yeah, it's going to come down to what the particular issue on that day is, I believe.
I'm Sam Hadley. I've heard you talk about self-defence, as in tasers and pepper spray. I haven't heard you talk much about the right to bear arms, and whether you think there's a place for that in WA. Yeah,
I do. I do think there's a sort of natural right to self-defence, and we need a practical means for that. Firearms aren't always the best way to defend yourself, but sometimes they are. And one thing I'd like to see is that self-defence become a legitimate reason for owning a firearm. It currently isn't. It is LDP policy to have things like concealed carry and bring back semi-autos. In a perfect libertarian world, we'd all have recreational nukes. But we have to take it step by step. So, I think eventually we could have those things, but it would take a very long time. The sort of the culture around firearms isn't there at the moment. Everyone in Australia is a bit of a hoplophobe when it comes to firearms. But when you look at the stats and the data, places in the US where they have concealed carry or open carry have the lowest firearm violence rates. They have quite often the lowest violence rates. The really violent places are the inner cities, the Democratic-run places, where they've got drug problems and crappy schooling systems. So, there are really good examples out there like New Zealand and Switzerland and the Czech Republic where they have quite liberal firearm laws and they don't have gun violence. Australia doesn't have much of a gun culture like the US does. So I think having more liberal gun laws in Australia wouldn't result in the same violence they have in the US. Also, we don't have the same, we have a war on drugs here, but it's not quite as violent as it is in the US. So, liberalising, relaxing gun laws, I think would be a good thing. There's scope for it to happen in this Parliament with myself, Rick Mazza from the Shooters and Fishers Party. Maybe we can, convince the One Nation guys to back us. But yeah, no, I'm very much for more liberalised gun laws. Absolutely. Anyone else? No.
Hey, so I'm a Liberal Party member and campaigner, but also...
Yeah, so Ahmed Suleiman, or am I thinking of someone else?
Yeah.
I've seen you on Facebook, yeah.
Yeah, no worries. And also a very active libertarian. I'm currently chairing Students for Liberty nationally, so on both ends I'm fairly active. The media sort of tried to portray this whole sort of right-wing coalition of One Nation, you, Shooters and Fishers, etc. Do you think that's a helpful image for starters? And then secondly, on sort of Liberals and the smaller Liberal party room nowadays, do you think there's more people they could possibly work with? Because I suggest a few members of the lower house are quite good on a lot of issues, but maybe they're not as vocal. Maybe that's something we can have a chat about later.
Yeah, so the way the media has portrayed the crossbench, it certainly doesn't hurt. I mean, there's always a chance that someone who's a real, hardcore libertarian might see that and go, oh, why is he throwing his lot in with One Nation? I don't want any part of that. I hope I've gotten the message out there that I'd like to think, at least, that I'm quite a principled person. I'd rather stick to my values, my principles, and have no friends than compromise on those and be friends with the crossbench. Now, in terms of the how the crossbench might work, I mean, Rick Mazza is a conservative, so I'll find a few things I can work with him there on in terms of economics, but not so much on the social level. One Nation, look, they're all good guys, but they don't have that underlying philosophy that tells you what they're going to do. So with One Nation, it's kind of issue by issue, and they're quite often swayed by whatever popular opinion is at the time, which can be good but bad at times too. What I have though is that, here's a bunch of guys from a minor party. I'm from a minor party, so we hang out, we work together, we communicate openly, to our mutual benefit really. But when it comes to how I'll vote, that will always be, in line with libertarian philosophy and Liberal Democrat policy. In terms of the Liberal Party, there are quite a few guys that agree with me on a lot of issues, but not all. Peter Katzenbarnis in the lower house, I've run into him a few times, and we haven't spoken so much about classical liberal philosophy, but more like music taste. Everyone keeps coming to me to talk to me about music because I think that was one of the first things the news put out about me. But there are a few people there that I can see, we've got the same ideas, but there's always that one exception, Yes, I believe in liberty, but I don't think people should be able to smoke cannabis. Or, yes, I believe in liberty, but, I want to continue pushing the drug war. So there's always that one issue where we don't see 100% eye to eye with. But I am pragmatic. If there's people I can work with, I'll happily work with them. Yeah. And was there another question, or was that it? I think that was it. Yeah, cool. Anyone else?
Sorry. Chris Shields here. I was just wondering, overall, do you reckon McGowan government's an upgrade or downgrade on the Barnett government? Cheers.
Yeah, that's hard to say. They've only been in for a couple of months so far. They are talking seriously about reducing debt. We'll have to wait and see in September what their budget actually is. So I'd say it's too hard. It's too early to say right now. However, I'm no fan of Barnett's. There are very few things very few nice things I could say about him. So that's not a very high bar for them to beat, in my view. I'm optimistic. I mean, the Labor Party is, sort of, influenced by unions and left-wing lobby groups and all that. But however, they seem to be coming at it from a rather pragmatic, rather practical angle. So I'm holding my breath, waiting to see what they actually do first.
Aaron Michael Darby is my name. In Western Australia there are some organisations which are registered charities. And those registered charities spend their time and an awful lot of money donated to them campaigning against fishing, against farming, against almost everything, but especially against mining. I'm referring to things like the World Wide Fund for Nature and the Wilderness Society. There's a whole raft of them. Do you have a view on whether registered charities should be permitted to be frauds? And if you have a view, what would you like to do about it?
Well, if there's any... I haven't had much involvement in politics before this, of course, so I'm not familiar with registered charities, sort of lobbying for further environmental regulations and restrictions. I will say, though, that I'm hesitant to jump on board with the idea of removing any kind of tax exemption from groups like that, because it would be increasing taxes. So anyone who anyone who's able to avoid taxes, more power to them. However, if they're receiving special protections, public funds, subsidies from the government, that's something I'm very much against. But I'm not familiar with those organisations. So, my view is charities, lobby groups, they're fine. They should fund themselves. They shouldn't be funded by taxpayers' money. So long as they're doing that, I generally don't have a problem with them.
Great answer.
Anyone else? Otherwise, I think I'll hand over to Ellie.
Aaron.
Yep.
Hi, I'm Ellie Bernstein from Liberty WA. Now, a wise man once said, politicians, they have to stand, they hope to stand, they're resigned to sit, but are forced to lie. It's great to see an exception to the rule in our politicians here tonight. So I'm here to give a vote of thanks for exposing the Nanny State and for allowing you to fight it. And we wish you success in that mission and hope that you succeed. Now, just a bit about Liberty WA, just a bit of a plug. Liberty WA is a politically unaffiliated group that has been all aligned to the Economic Party. But we are there to obviously change the discourse of politics towards liberty, both on an individual basis and through society and politics as well. When we first launched about a couple of years ago, there was very few voices for liberty in West Australia. There was manpower, basically that was it. And it's great now to see a lot of competition. We like competition as a libertarian value, and we have LibertyWorks, which is doing fantastic work, the Australian Libertarian Society, and we also have at the universities, various organizations, Students for Liberty, for example, and of course the LDP, and now it's at the Senator. So after having a short hiatus, Liberty WA is actually looking to reorganize itself, and we are looking for members to join the committee. I'm looking around at some new member faces. And what we're planning this year is to, well, initially with something very basic and old-fashioned, a book club on classical liberal books. Something people don't do is read. And so we hope to start with that. Also hosting debates on key policy issues and drafting a few policy positions on issues affecting liberty. And so we look forward to collaborating with all liberty-minded individuals and organizations in WA. And we hope to a future where citizens are given more rights and responsibilities to determine their own fate. So now in lieu of a bottle of wine, I mean, we didn't manage that, but I do have a couple of pills of ecstasy. Just kidding. All right. Thank you very much.